The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone could stop it, and every head at the long dinner table turned toward the sound. Alistair Vane stood frozen with his hand still raised, the wine he had been pouring now spreading across the white tablecloth like a wound. 40 guests watched him in silence, waiting to see what the new Duke would do next, and it was his stepsister who broke the quiet first. Camilla Rothford rose from her chair with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She lifted her own glass toward him, and her voice carried easily across the hushed room. "A toast," she said, "to my brother the Duke who cannot hold a family together, let alone build one." A few guests laughed nervously. Others looked down at their plates, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak against her. Alistair set down the wine bottle with careful, deliberate hands, though his jaw had gone tight and pale. "That is enough, Camilla," he said quietly. "Is it?" She stepped closer, her silk gown catching the candlelight. "You come home after years away, you take my father's title, and you expect us all to pretend you are fit to carry it. Everyone at this table has heard the rumors, Alistair, about the men you keep company with, about why there is no wife on your arm and why there never will be an heir in your nursery." The room went utterly still. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a servant nearly dropped a tray of glasses and steadied it just in time. Alistair felt every eye on him, felt the old, familiar heat of shame rising in his chest, the same shame he had carried since he was a boy hiding in libraries, instead of playing on the lawns with other sons of noble houses. He did not raise his voice. He did not deny anything. He simply looked at his stepsister, at the woman who had shared his father's house for 15 years and had never once looked at him as family, and he said, "You may say what you like about me at this table, Camilla, but you will not say it about this house or about the people who depend on it. The people who depend on it deserve better than a duke who cannot give this family a future," Camilla shot back. "You are gay, Alistair. Everyone whispers it, and I am simply the only one honest enough to say it aloud. And even if that were not true, we both know the fever you had as a boy left you unable to father a child. So tell me, brother, what future do you intend to give this house?" The words landed like a blow, and for a moment Alistair could not speak at all. It was one thing to carry a secret quietly for years, guarding it behind polite smiles and careful distance. It was another thing entirely to hear it spoken aloud in front of 40 witnesses, in the dining hall where his father used to sit at the head of the table with pride in his eyes. Alistair set his shoulders straight. He would not run from this room, and he would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. "You have said your piece," he told her, his voice steady now, low and controlled. "I will not make a spectacle of myself by answering cruelty with cruelty. This dinner is over. I thank you all for coming." He turned and walked from the hall without another word, his footsteps echoing against the marble long after the doors had closed behind him. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of the guests rising like a wave, could imagine the whispers already spreading through the city by morning. By tomorrow, all of society would know what Camilla had said. By tomorrow, the newspapers might know it too. He did not stop walking until he reached his father's old study, the one room in the house that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper, the one room where he had always felt safe as a boy. He closed the door behind him and stood very still in the dark, his heart pounding, his hands shaking now that no one could see them. For years he had told himself that if he simply worked hard enough, if he simply proved himself capable enough as a man of business and a caretaker of the estate, no one would think to ask about his private life. He had built walls so carefully, spoken so carefully, lived so carefully. And in one evening, his stepsister had torn all of it down in front of the very people whose respect he needed most. He crossed to the window and looked out over the gardens, silver and quiet under the moon. Somewhere beyond those hedges was the family chapel where his mother was buried, and beyond that, the small cottage where the estate's oldest tenant families still lived, families who trusted him to keep their home safe. He thought of them now, of the promises he had made to protect this house and everyone who depended on it, and slowly his shaking hands grew still. He was gay. That much was true, And he was tired, suddenly and completely tired, of treating it as a wound to be hidden rather than simply a fact of who he was. He was also infertile, the result of a fever that had nearly killed him when he was 9 years old, a fever that had left the family doctor with grim news that his parents had never fully explained to him until he was old enough to understand it himself. Camilla had used both truths as weapons tonight, expecting them to destroy him. But he would not be destroyed. He said the words aloud to the empty room, quietly, as though testing how they sounded outside his own head. "I am not ashamed." The words felt strange and new, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. He was not ashamed of who he loved, and he would no longer let his stepsister's cruelty decide how he carried himself in his own home. Whatever came next, whatever scandal spread through the city by morning, he would meet it standing upright. There was a soft knock at the door, and before he could answer, it opened just enough for a familiar face to appear. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper who had served this family since before Alastair was born, stepped inside with a tray of tea she had clearly prepared without being asked. "I thought you might want this, Your Grace," she said gently, setting the tray down on the desk. "And I thought you might want to know that not everyone in that room agreed with what was said tonight. Lord Ashby left early in disgust. Lady Bryce would not even look at Miss Camilla for the rest of the evening." Alastair managed a tired smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. That is kind of you to tell me." "It is not kindness, Your Grace. It is the truth." She studied him for a long moment, the way she used to study him as a boy when he came in from the gardens with a scraped knee, deciding how much comfort he would allow himself to accept. "Your father built this house with his own hands raised against far worse storms than this one. You have his strength in you, whether you believe it tonight or not." After she left, Alastair sat alone with the tea growing cold beside him, thinking not of Camilla's cruelty, but of what he intended to do about it. He would not spend the rest of his life hiding from a truth that everyone already suspected. He would not let his stepsister's bitterness decide the future of the house his father had trusted him to protect. Whatever plan formed in his mind that night was still rough and unshaped, but one thing had already become clear to him in the quiet of that study. He would answer her mockery not with anger, but with action so unexpected that no one in that dining hall would ever forget it. Word soon reached the far corners of the city, carried by servants who had overheard, by guests eager to share the scandal at their own dinner tables, by newspapers that printed careful, coded references to certain rumors surrounding the young Duke of Vane House. Within 2 days, half of society seemed to know what had been said, though few knew the full truth behind it. Alastair kept to the estate managing correspondence, meeting with his father's old advisers, refusing every invitation that arrived at his door. He was not hiding, he told himself. He was simply choosing his moment. Camilla, for her part, seemed pleased with the effect of her words. She held court at afternoon teas, accepting the sympathetic glances of women who whispered about poor Camilla, left to manage that family's reputation alone. She did not seem to notice, or perhaps did not care, that a handful of the oldest and most respected families in the city had quietly stopped inviting her to their homes, unwilling to be associated with such open cruelty toward a man who had done nothing to deserve it publicly. Behind the walls of the estate, however, one person watched the unfolding scandal with far more worry than satisfaction. Julian Marsh, the estate's solicitor and the man who had known Alastair since their years together at university, arrived at the house on the 3rd morning after the dinner, his carriage pulling up the long drive just as the sun broke through the clouds. He found Alastair in the study, surrounded by ledgers and letters, looking as though he had not slept properly in days. "You look terrible," Julian said, without preamble, closing the door behind him. "Thank you," Alastair replied dryly, not looking up from the papers in front of him. "It is good to see you too." "I heard what happened." Julian crossed the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, the same chair he had sat in 100 times before to discuss estate business, though his eyes now held something far more personal than business. "The whole city has heard what happened, Alastair. Are you well? Alistair finally set down his pen and looked at his old friend, and something in his chest loosened slightly at the sight of him, the way it always did. I am still standing, he said. That will have to be enough for now. Julian studied him carefully, the way he always did, as though trying to read the things Alistair would not say aloud. She said things at that table that should never have been said in public. I am sorry, Alistair. Truly. She only said what everyone already whispered, Alistair replied, though his voice was quieter now. I have spent years pretending the whispers did not exist. Perhaps it was foolish to think I could keep pretending forever. It was not foolish, it was survival. Julian leaned forward, his voice dropping. This world has not been kind to men like us, and you know that as well as I do. But there is a difference between choosing your own privacy and having it torn from you in front of 40 strangers. What she did was cruel, not honest. Alistair looked at him for a long moment, grateful in a way he did not know how to put into words. Julian had always understood him without needing lengthy explanations. Ever since their first year at university, when two lonely young men had found in each other something neither had expected to find. They had never spoken openly of what existed between them, not in all the years since, careful always to keep their friendship dressed in the safe, ordinary language of business partners and old classmates. But Alistair had never stopped loving him, not for a single day, and some quiet part of him suspected Julian felt the same. I need your help, Alistair said finally, straightening in his chair. Not with comforting words, Julian, though I am grateful for them. I need your help with something else. My father left conditions on this title that I have not yet told you about, and Camilla's mockery has only made the matter more urgent. Julian's expression sharpened with immediate attention, the solicitor in him rising to meet the friend. Tell me everything, he said, and we will find a way through it together as we always have. Outside the study window, the garden stood quiet under the pale morning light, unaware of the storm that had already begun to gather over the house, and of the far greater storm that was still to come. To understand why Camilla hated her stepbrother so deeply, one had to go back nearly 20 years, to a winter when the Vane house had been full of grief rather than gossip. Camilla's mother, the first wife of Duke Edmund Vane, had died when Camilla was only 5 years old, leaving her father a widower with a small daughter and a grand house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. For 3 years, Edmund had raised Camilla alone, doting on her completely, taking her on his knee each evening to hear about her day, promising her again and again that she would always be the most important person in his life. Then Edmund had married again, a gentle woman named Margaret who came into the house with a young son of her own, a quiet boy of 6 named Alistair who kept mostly to the library and rarely spoke unless spoken to first. Camilla remembered the day they arrived with painful clarity even now, remembered standing at the top of the grand staircase, and watching her father lift Alistair into his arms with the same warmth he had once reserved only for her, remembered the cold, sharp feeling in her chest that told her, even at 8 years old, that something precious had just been taken from her and given to a stranger. It was not fair, and no one had ever explained to her why it had to happen. Margaret was kind to her, patient and warm in ways Camilla grew to resent rather than appreciate, because kindness from a stranger felt like an insult to the memory of her own mother. And Alistair, quiet, watchful Alistair, seemed to win her father's attention so easily, simply by being clever with numbers and careful with his manners, simply by being exactly the kind of son a duke was supposed to want. Camilla had spent her childhood convinced that she was being replaced, and no amount of reassurance from her father had ever fully erased that fear. When Margaret died of a long illness 11 years later, and Edmund began to lean more heavily on Alistair for matters of the estate rather than on his own daughter, that old childhood wound reopened, deeper and angrier than before. By the time Alistair left for his years abroad, Camilla had convinced herself completely that he had taken everything that should have belonged to her, the affection, the training, the trust, and eventually the title itself. She was not entirely wrong to feel wronged, though she had never once considered that Alistair had felt just as displaced as she had, arriving as a frightened boy into a grand house full of strangers, watched constantly for signs that he did not belong. He had never asked for the dukedom. He had never asked to be raised as a duke's heir instead of simply as a boy who loved books and quiet evenings, and later, a particular young man he had met at university. But resentment rarely listens to nuance, and Camilla had built her entire understanding of her stepbrother on the belief that his gain had always meant her loss. That belief had calcified over the years into something closer to bitterness, and bitterness, given enough time and enough encouragement from those who benefited from her anger, could curdle into cruelty. In recent months, Camilla had begun keeping company with Percival Grey, a charming and ambitious minor lord who had taken a great interest in her, an interest that felt, for the first time in years, like being chosen rather than overlooked. Percival was attentive in ways her father had never quite managed to be after Margaret's death, and he was very good at listening to her old grievances and gently, patiently, fanning them into flame. "Your stepbrother has taken everything that should be yours," Percival told her often, over quiet dinners and long carriage rides through the city. "The title, the estate, the respect of society. And for what? A man who cannot even give this family an heir, who hides secrets that would shame any noble house. You deserve better, Camilla. You deserve what was always meant to be yours." Camilla had told herself for months that she loved Percival, that his attention was proof of her own worth after years of feeling invisible in her father's house. She did not yet understand, though she would come to understand it painfully in time, that Percival's affection was carefully calculated, that his interest in her had far more to do with her nearness to the vain title than with any genuine regard for her heart. All she knew, on the night of that terrible dinner, was that Percival had encouraged her for weeks to speak the truth about Alistair loudly and publicly, promising her that once society turned against her stepbrother, the path would clear for her own claim to the estate. She had done exactly as he suggested, and she had gone to bed that night feeling triumphant, certain that she had finally taken back what belonged to her. Meanwhile, in the quiet of Alistair's study, the conversation between the Duke and his old friend continued long into the afternoon. Alistair explained, slowly and carefully, the conditions his father had left attached to the title before his death 2 months earlier, conditions that Edmund had insisted upon in his final weeks, worried and frightened for the future of a house he loved. The estate required an heir within a fixed span of years, or the title and its lands would pass by an older clause of succession to whichever family member could produce a legitimate line first. At the time Edmund had written the condition, he had not known the full truth about his son's private life, only that Alistair had shown no interest in marriage even as he approached 30 years of age. "He never asked me outright," Alistair said quietly, turning a small portrait of his father over in his hands. "I think, in some way, he already suspected, but he loved me enough not to force the question, and I loved him enough not to make him ask it. Now I wonder if that silence between us was a mistake." "It was not a mistake to protect each other," Julian said gently. "It was simply the only way either of you knew how to survive in a world that offers so little patience for the truth." Alistair set the portrait down and looked at his old friend across the desk, the weight of the coming years settling heavily over his shoulders. "The clause gives me 2 years, Julian. 2 years to produce an heir, or the estate passes to whichever relative can claim the strongest line of succession. Camilla's husband, should she marry within that time, would stand first among the claimants." Julian's eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. "You believe Percival Grey already knows this?" "I believe Camilla's sudden cruelty at dinner was not simply the result of old resentment," Alistair said. "I believe someone encouraged her to speak, hoping the scandal would weaken my position before I could take any steps to protect it." For a long moment, neither man spoke, the weight of the situation settling between them like a physical presence in the room. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift toward evening, painting long golden shadows across the study floor. "What will you do?" Julian asked finally. Alistair rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens where he had spent so many lonely childhood hours among his mother's roses, learning to love a house that had never quite felt entirely his own until now, when it was under threat of being taken away. "I will not marry a woman I do not love simply to satisfy an old clause written by a frightened, dying man," he said. "I will not deceive anyone, least of all myself, to keep a title I never asked for in the first place. But I also will not let this house fall into the hands of a man like Percival Gray, who cares nothing for the tenants who depend on it, nothing for the promises my father made to the families who have lived on this land for generations." "Then what will you do instead?" Julian asked again, softer this time. Alistair turned from the window, and something had settled in his expression, a calm resolve that had not been there before, the first true clarity he had felt since the humiliation of that dinner table. "I do not yet know the whole shape of it," he admitted, "but I know it will not be the future Camilla or Percival expect. And I know I will need you beside me while I find it, Julian, as I have needed you beside me for longer than I have ever properly said aloud." The words hung in the air between them, quieter and more honest than anything either man had allowed himself to say in all their years of careful friendship. Julian rose from his chair slowly, crossing the small distance of the study until he stood close enough that Alistair could see the answer in his eyes before he ever spoke it. "I have been beside you since the day we met," Julian said. "I do not intend to stop now, whatever comes." It was not a declaration wrapped in poetry, nor a promise made with grand gestures, but it was enough, in that quiet study with the evening light fading gently around them, for both men to understand exactly what had passed between them, a truth they had circled for years finally allowed, at last, to stand plainly in the open air. Neither of them yet knew how much that quiet truth would cost them in the months ahead, nor how much courage it would demand of them both. But for the first time since the humiliation of the dinner table, Alistair felt something other than shame settle into his chest. He felt the beginnings of a plan, rough and dangerous and entirely his own, and beside him, steady as he had always been, stood the one person in the world he trusted enough to help him carry it through. 2 days later, Alistair traveled into the city to meet with Mr. Sinclair, the elderly lawyer who had drafted his father's final papers, and who alone held a complete copy of the succession clause locked away in his office. The meeting had been arranged quietly, without informing the household staff, for Alistair wanted no rumor of his intentions reaching Camilla before he understood fully what he was dealing with. Mr. Sinclair received him in a small, book-lined office that smelled of ink and old leather, and greeted him with the careful respect of a man who had known 3 generations of the Vane family, and had learned, over many years, to keep their secrets close. "Your Grace," he said, gesturing Alistair to a chair, "I confess I expected you might come, after what happened at dinner. News such as that does not stay quiet for long in this city." "Then you already understand why I am here," Alistair said, settling into the chair across from the old lawyer's desk. "I need to understand exactly what my father wrote into that succession clause, and exactly what options remain open to me." Mr. Sinclair drew a thin folder from a locked drawer and set it carefully on the desk between them, though he did not open it immediately. "Your father was a frightened man in his final months, Your Grace. Frightened for the estate, frightened for the tenants who depend upon it, and frightened, I believe, that he had not done enough to prepare you for the burdens he was leaving behind. The clause he wrote was born of that fear, not of any doubt in your character." "I understand that," Alistair said quietly. "I do not blame him for it. But I need to know what it actually requires of me, and whether there is any lawful path forward that does not involve a marriage I cannot in good conscience enter." The old lawyer studied him for a long moment, and something gentle passed across his weathered face, an understanding that surprised Alistair, though perhaps it should not have. Mr. Sinclair had served this family for 40 years. He had likely guessed a great deal more about Alistair's private life than he had ever spoken aloud. "There is a path," Mr. Sinclair said finally, opening the folder. "It is not commonly used, and it is not without its complications, but the law of succession in this country has long recognized formal adoption as a legitimate means of securing an heir, provided the adoption is completed through proper legal channels, and the child is raised within the household as a true member of the family. Your father's clause does not specify that the heir must be born of your own body, your grace. Only that a legitimate heir must be secured within the stated years. Alistair felt something shift in his chest, a door opening where he had believed only walls existed. "Tell me everything," he said, leaning forward. "I need to understand every requirement, every risk, before I take a single step forward." For the next 2 hours, Mr. Sinclair walked him carefully through the legal requirements of formal adoption among noble houses, the documentation required, the court approvals necessary, and the various ways such a claim might be challenged by a rival claimant determined to contest it. It would not be simple. It would not be quiet. But it was possible, and possible was more than Alistair had believed he had that morning when he first climbed the steps to Mr. Sinclair's office. As he rode back toward the estate that evening, the city lights beginning to glow gold against the darkening sky, Alistair found his thoughts drifting to a small, quiet boy he had met 18 months earlier during one of his charitable visits to a home for orphaned children on the edge of the city. The boy's name was Theo, and he had lost both his parents to illness within the same terrible winter, leaving him without any family at all. Alistair had visited him many times since then, quietly, without any public announcement, drawn to the boy's careful watchfulness, so similar to his own childhood loneliness in a house too large and too empty for a single frightened child. He had never imagined, in all those quiet visits, that Theo might one day become something more than a boy he simply cared for from a distance. But now, as the carriage rolled through the gathering dusk, a new shape began to form in Alistair's mind, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably real. A shape that might yet answer both the demands of his father's clause and the quiet longing in his own heart for a family built on honesty rather than obligation. He did not yet know how Camilla would react, nor how deeply Percival Gray's ambitions would try to destroy the plan before it could take root. But for the first time since that terrible dinner, Alistair rode home with something steadier than fear settling into his chest, and it felt, for now, enough to carry him forward into whatever came next. Alistair had not spoken of his father's final hours to anyone, not even to Julian, though the memory returned to him now with unusual clarity as he lay awake that night turning over the possibilities Mr. Sinclair had laid before him. He remembered the dim candlelight of his father's bedroom, the shallow, uneven breathing that had grown weaker with each passing hour, and the desperate grip of Edmund's hand around his own, as the old Duke fought to say everything he had left unsaid for 30 years. "Promise me," Edmund had whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "Promise me you will not let this house fall to ruin. Promise me you will give it a future." Alistair had promised, of course, kneeling at his father's bedside with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in front of anyone else, because there was nothing else a dying man's son could say in that moment except yes, and I promise, and I will not fail you. He had not fully understood in that moment of grief exactly what shape his promise would eventually have to take. He had only understood that he loved his father, despite every silence and every unspoken question that had passed between them over the years, and that he would do whatever it took to honor a house that had, despite everything, become his own. Edmund had died 3 hours later, just as the first gray light of morning touched the windows, and Alistair had sat beside him in silence until the household staff gently came to tell him it was time to begin the arrangements. He had not cried again after that first night. He had simply straightened his shoulders, the way he had learned to do as a small boy arriving into a strange new house, and had begun the long, careful work of becoming a duke. Now, lying awake in the dark 2 months later, Alistair understood that the promise he had made to his dying father did not require him to betray himself in order to keep it. His father had wanted a future for the house, not a lie dressed up as a marriage, not a wife chosen only to satisfy an old clause of succession. Theo deserved a family who wanted him for exactly who he was, not merely as a legal solution to a problem. And Alistair intended to give the boy nothing less than that same honesty his father had, in the end, given him. He rose before dawn and dressed quietly, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, his carriage was already rolling toward the small home for orphaned children on the edge of the city. a modest building he had funded quietly for the past several years without ever attaching his name publicly to the effort. The matron who ran the home, a kind and sharp-eyed woman named Grace Ellery, greeted him warmly at the door, as she always did, though she raised an eyebrow at the earliness of his visit. "You are here before the children have even finished breakfast, Your Grace," she said, leading him inside. "Is something troubling you?" "Everything and nothing," Alastair admitted. "I need to speak with you about Theo if you have the time this morning." Grace's expression sharpened with quiet attention, and she led him into her small office at the back of the building, closing the door behind them for privacy. "You have visited that boy more than any other child in this house, Your Grace, for well over a year now. I confess I wondered when this conversation might come." Alastair sat across from her, choosing his words with care. "I want to formally adopt him, Grace. Not as a quiet arrangement, not as something hidden away from the world, but properly, legally, with his name entered into the family record as my heir. I know this is not a simple request, and I know there will be scrutiny like nothing this home has ever faced before. I need to know, honestly, whether you believe it would be good for him." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying the Duke with the careful eyes of a woman who had spent 20 years protecting children from adults who claimed to want what was best for them while truly wanting something else entirely. "Why him, Your Grace? There are dozens of children in this city who need a home. Why this particular boy?" "Because I see myself in him," Alastair said simply. "I was a quiet boy once too, watchful and careful in a house that felt too large and too cold, uncertain whether anyone truly wanted me there. Theo reminds me of that boy every time I visit him, and I find myself wanting, more than I have wanted anything in a very long time, to give him what I never quite had, a home where he does not have to earn his place by being useful or clever or convenient. I want to give him a home simply because he belongs in it." Grace's sharp expression softened slightly, though she did not yet smile. "That is a fine sentiment, Your Grace, and I believe you mean it. But I must ask you plainly, because the boy's welfare matters more to me than your title or your reasons. There will be scandal attached to this." "There already is scandal attached to your name, forgive my bluntness, given what half the city is already whispering. Are you prepared for what Theo will face, growing up as the adopted heir of a duke surrounded by rumor?" Alastair met her gaze without flinching. "I would rather he face scrutiny as a boy who is loved openly and honestly than grow up, as I did, learning that love must be hidden to be safe. Whatever storm comes, Grace, I intend to stand between him and the worst of it for as long as I am able. That is the only promise I can make you, but it is one I intend to keep for the rest of my life." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Grace finally allowed herself a small, careful smile. "Then I will not stand in your way, Your Grace. But I will be watching closely, and if I ever believe that boy is suffering more than he is loved, I will not hesitate to say so to your face, title or no title." "I would expect nothing less from you," Alastair said, and for the first time in days, something like genuine warmth crept into his chest. She led him out into the small courtyard where the children had gathered after breakfast, and it did not take long to spot Theo among them, sitting slightly apart from the others on a low stone wall, watching a game of chase with quiet, careful eyes rather than joining in. He was a slight boy of 8, with dark hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes no matter how often it was cut, and an expression far too solemn for a child his age. He looked up as Alastair approached, and something in his small, guarded face brightened, just slightly, in a way it never did for the other adults who occasionally visited the home. "You came early today," Theo said, sliding down from the wall. "I did," Alastair agreed, crouching slightly so he was closer to the boy's height, as he always did during these visits. "I wanted to ask you something important, Theo, and I wanted to ask it properly, not in a rush." Theo's careful eyes studied him, the same watchful expression Alastair remembered wearing himself as a child, sizing up every new adult who entered his life, waiting to learn whether they could be trusted, or whether they would eventually disappear like so many others had. "What is it?" Alastair took a slow breath, choosing his words as carefully as he had chosen them with Grace, wanting the boy to understand fully what was being offered rather than simply hearing grand promises he might not yet believe. "I would like you to come and live with me, Theo. Not as a visitor, and not for a short while, but for good as my son, with my name and my house and my protection for as long as you want it. I cannot promise you a simple life, because there are people who may not be kind about the decision, but I can promise you that you will never again wonder whether you have a place in this world. You will." For a long moment, Theo said nothing at all, his small hands twisting together in front of him, and Alistair waited, refusing to rush him, understanding better than almost anyone how much courage it took for a child who had already lost everything once to risk trusting anyone with his heart a second time. "You mean it," Theo said finally, not quite a question. "I mean it completely," Alistair said. "There is no undoing this decision once it is made, Theo. I do not offer it lightly, and I would not offer it at all if I did not intend to keep my word for the rest of my life." Slowly, hesitantly, Theo stepped forward and for the first time in all their visits together, reached out and took Alistair's hand in his own small one. "Then yes," he said quietly. "I would like that very much." Alistair felt something break open in his chest, warm and overwhelming, a feeling he had not allowed himself to expect. He had come to the home that morning with careful legal reasoning and a plan born partly of necessity, but standing now in the courtyard with Theo's small hand in his, he understood that this was no longer simply a strategy to satisfy his father's clause. It had become, in the space of a single conversation, something far more important than that. He rode back toward the estate that afternoon with the beginnings of legal papers already forming in his mind, and with a fierce, protective determination settling into his chest that had nothing at all to do with titles or succession clauses. Whatever Camilla and Percival Gray were plotting in the drawing rooms of the city, whatever scandal still waited to unfold, Alistair intended to meet it now not merely as a duke defending his inheritance, but as a father defending his son. He did not yet know that, on that very same afternoon, Percival Gray was seated across from Camilla in her private sitting room, laying out with careful precision exactly how quickly he intended to press for marriage, nor how urgently he intended to move once he learned, through a servant's careless gossip only 2 days later, exactly what the Duke had been quietly arranging at the edge of the city. "An orphan," Percival said, when the news reached him, his voice carrying a dangerous edge of calculation beneath its practiced calm. "He means to adopt some nameless orphan and call it an heir. Clever, I will give him that. But clever plans can still be broken, Camilla, if we move quickly enough and quietly enough." Camilla, who had spent the days since the dinner half convinced of her own triumph, felt a small, uncomfortable flicker of doubt at his words, though she pushed it down before it could take proper shape. "What do you mean to do?" Percival smiled, slow and certain, and reached for her hand across the small table between them. "I mean to make certain that when the courts examine this adoption, they find reasons enough to doubt its legitimacy. And I mean to make certain that by the time any of it is settled, you and I are already married, with a claim to this estate that no quiet orphan boy can ever challenge." Camilla nodded slowly, telling herself this was justice rather than cruelty, telling herself she was simply reclaiming what had always belonged to her. She did not yet know how completely she had been drawn into a scheme that had far less to do with her own happiness than Percival had ever allowed her to believe. That evening, Percival left Camilla's sitting room and traveled instead to a narrow, unremarkable street on the far side of the city, to a small office above a bookshop where a clerk named Henry Bramwell worked long hours copying legal documents for a modest fee and asked few questions about the men who paid him. Percival had used Henry's services twice before, in matters he preferred to keep entirely separate from his public reputation, and he trusted the clerk's discretion precisely, because Henry's own circumstances left him little room to refuse a well-paying client. "I need papers drafted," Percival said, once the office door was closed and the shop below had gone quiet for the night. "Papers that will suggest irregularities in an adoption process, questions about the child's true parenthood, doubts sufficient to delay a court's approval for months, perhaps longer." Henry studied him carefully across the cluttered desk, his pen resting motionless in his ink-stained fingers. "That is a serious request, my lord. Forged doubt is still forgery, whatever name you give it." "It is not forgery," Percival said smoothly. "It is merely the careful arrangement of questions that deserve to be asked. I am not asking you to invent lies, Henry. I am asking you to help me ensure the right questions reach the right ears at the right time." Henry hesitated, glancing toward the small drawer where he kept the coin from his previous work for this particular lord, coin that had kept his family fed through a difficult winter the year before. Whatever doubts flickered behind his eyes, they did not last long against the weight of old debts and present need. "It will cost more this time," he said finally, "given what you are asking." "Name your price," Percival said, already reaching for his coin purse. "I intend to be Duke of this estate within the year, Henry, and a man in that position remembers who served him well when it mattered most." Henry took the payment without meeting his eyes fully, and by the time Percival left the small office an hour later, the outline of a scheme had begun to take dangerous shape, one that would plant careful seeds of doubt about Theo's origins in, exactly, the circles most likely to slow the adoption's legal progress. It was not an honest plan, and some quiet part of Percival recognized that fact even as he walked back toward his own comfortable townhouse through the darkened streets. But he had spent too many years watching wealthier men inherit titles and estates through nothing more than the accident of birth, while his own modest inheritance left him always one step behind, always required to marry well or scheme carefully simply to secure the kind of life he believed he deserved. He told himself that ambition was not the same thing as cruelty, though the distinction grew thinner with every visit to Henry Bramwell's cluttered little office. Camilla, meanwhile, sat alone in her sitting room long after Percival had gone, staring into the dying embers of the fire with a restlessness she could not quite name. She thought of the dinner table, of the shocked silence that had followed her words, of Alistair's quiet, controlled voice telling her that the dinner was over. She had expected to feel triumphant in the days since, and for the most part she had. But there had been something in her stepbrother's eyes as he left the room that night, something steady and unbroken despite everything she had said, that troubled her more than she wanted to admit. She remembered, unbidden, a much older memory, one she had not thought of in years. She had been perhaps 10 years old, and Alistair 7, newly arrived in the house and still learning his way through its long corridors. She had found him one afternoon crying quietly behind the curtains of the east drawing-room, having become lost trying to find his mother's chambers, frightened and ashamed to ask any of the servants for help. She remembered with an old, uncomfortable pang that she had not comforted him that day. She had laughed at him instead, called him a foolish little boy who could not even find his way through his own new home, and had walked away leaving him alone behind the curtains. She had told herself for years that such small cruelties did not matter, that they were simply the ordinary friction of children forced to share a house and a father's attention. But sitting alone now, years later, with the memory of Alistair's steady, unbroken composure at that terrible dinner replaying in her mind, she found herself wondering, for the first time in a very long while, whether the boy behind the curtains had ever truly stopped feeling as alone as he had that day. She pushed the thought away quickly, telling herself it was nothing more than the wine from dinner making her sentimental, and rose to retire for the evening. But the memory did not fully leave her, lingering instead at the edges of her mind like a small, persistent splinter, waiting for the moment it would finally work its way to the surface. 2 weeks after the terrible dinner, invitations went out to every branch of the Vane family, formal and unmistakable in their language, summoning each relative to a family council at the estate on the following Saturday afternoon. Camilla received hers with a flicker of unease she could not quite explain, though Percival assured her, over tea the following morning, that it was likely nothing more than Alistair attempting to salvage his public reputation with some carefully staged display of composure. "Let him make his little speeches," Percival said, waving a dismissive hand. "It changes nothing. By the time any adoption reaches the courts, we will already have raised enough doubt to delay it for months, and by then, Camilla, You and I will already be married." Camilla nodded, though the old, uneasy feeling from that quiet evening by the fire had not fully left her, and it returned now with unexpected force as her carriage rolled up the long drive toward the estate on Saturday afternoon, past gardens she had known her entire life, toward a house that suddenly felt less certain to remain hers than it ever had before. The great hall had been arranged for the occasion, chairs set in a wide half-circle facing a raised dais where Alistair would stand, and by the appointed hour nearly 30 relatives had gathered, some curious, some concerned, a few clearly hoping for further scandal to carry back to their own drawing rooms. Camilla took her seat near the front, Percival beside her, and studied her stepbrother as he entered the hall, searching his face for any sign of the fear or shame she had expected to find there after the humiliation she had delivered 2 weeks earlier. She found none. Alistair walked to the dais with the same quiet, steady composure he had carried out of the dining hall that terrible night, dressed simply but impeccably, his expression calm in a way that unsettled her more than any visible distress would have done. Beside him, slightly behind and to the left, stood Julian Marsh, and a small boy Camilla did not recognize, dark-haired and solemn, dressed in a fine new coat that still seemed slightly unfamiliar on his thin shoulders. A murmur rippled through the gathered family as they noticed the child, questions passing quietly from chair to chair, but Alistair raised his hand and the hall fell silent, waiting. "Thank you all for coming," Alistair began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the great hall without need of raising it. "I know many of you have heard troubling things about me in recent weeks. I do not intend to spend this afternoon denying or defending against rumor and gossip. I intend instead to tell you the truth plainly, and to show you exactly what I mean to do about it." He paused, and Camilla felt her stomach tighten, though she could not have said exactly why. "It is true that I am not interested in marrying a woman," Alistair continued, his voice steady despite the ripple of shocked murmurs that swept through the hall at such an open admission. "I have known this about myself since I was a young man, and I have spent far too many years ashamed of a truth that harms no one and dishonors nothing. It is also true that a childhood illness left me unable to father children of my own. Both of these facts were spoken publicly at this family's own dinner table 2 weeks ago, intended, I believe, to shame me into silence or into abandoning the title my father entrusted to me." His eyes swept the hall, and for a brief moment they settled on Camilla, though his expression carried no anger, only a steady, unflinching clarity that felt somehow worse than fury would have. "I will not abandon it," he said, "and I will not marry a woman under false pretenses simply to satisfy an old clause never meant to punish honesty. Instead, I have chosen a different path, one entirely within the law and one I believe my father would have understood and blessed, had he lived long enough to see it." He turned slightly and rested a gentle hand on the shoulder of the boy beside him, who looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes before facing the room with careful, practiced courage. "This is Theo," Alistair said. "In the coming weeks I will complete the legal process to formally adopt him as my son and as the heir to this house. He will carry the Vane name, and he will inherit everything my father left behind, not because blood demands it, but because I have chosen him, freely and completely, exactly as any parent chooses to love a child." The hall erupted into a storm of whispered voices, some sympathetic, many scandalized, a few openly disapproving. Camilla sat frozen in her chair, staring at the small boy standing so bravely beside her stepbrother, feeling something complicated and unwelcome twist in her chest that she could not immediately name. Percival leaned close to her ear, his voice low and urgent. "This changes nothing," he whispered. "If anything, it makes our path clearer. A contested adoption, an orphan of unknown parentage, questions of legitimacy that will take the courts months to untangle. We move forward exactly as planned." But Camilla found herself only half listening, her attention caught instead by the way the boy's hand had crept, almost involuntarily, to grip the edge of Alistair's coat, the way Alistair had shifted his stance slightly, protectively, without seeming to think about it at all. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable amid the chaos of the hall, but it struck her with unexpected force, because she recognized in it something she had not seen from her father in the years after her own mother's death, not toward her, and rarely, if she was honest with herself, toward Alistair either. Alistair raised his hand again, and slowly the hall quieted, though the tension in the room remained thick and unresolved. "I know this will not please everyone gathered here today," he said. "I know some of you will contest this decision in the courts if necessary, and I am prepared to meet that challenge honestly and openly. But I will not raise my son in the shadow of shame, the way I was so often made to feel ashamed of who I am. He deserves better than that. This house deserves better than that. And I intend, from this day forward, to give both of them exactly what they deserve." He stepped down from the dais then, and the family council dissolved into a flurry of conversation, relatives clustering into small groups to discuss what they had just witnessed, some already drafting mental letters to lawyers of their own, others simply stunned into uncertain silence. Camilla remained seated for a long moment after the others had begun to rise, watching as Alistair knelt briefly beside Theo, speaking some quiet words she could not hear, and the boy's solemn face broke, just slightly, into the beginning of a smile. "Camilla," Percival said, touching her arm, "we should go. There is much to arrange now and little time to waste." She rose slowly, following him from the hall, but she found herself glancing back once more toward the dais where Alistair still knelt with the boy, and the old, uncomfortable splinter of memory from behind the drawing-room curtains pressed itself more firmly to the surface of her mind than it ever had before. She did not yet understand what was beginning to shift within her, and she would not fully understand it for weeks longer, buried as it still was beneath years of old resentment and Percival's careful, patient encouragement. But something had cracked that afternoon in the great hall, quietly and almost imperceptibly, the first small fracture in a wall she had spent 2 decades building brick by brick around her own bitterness. Outside, as the family carriages began rolling back down the long drive toward the city, the evening sky had turned a deep, burning orange over the gardens, and somewhere in the house behind them, Alistair sat with Theo in the quiet of the library, beginning, for the first time, to build the family he had chosen for himself, unafraid at last of who might be watching. Not everyone who left the hall that afternoon carried the same cold calculation as Percival Grey. Lady Charlotte Bryce, a distant cousin of Alistair's late mother, lingered behind after most of the family had gone, waiting until the great hall had nearly emptied before approaching the dais where Alistair still knelt beside Theo. She was an older woman, sharp-tongued and independent, known throughout the family for saying exactly what she thought regardless of who might be listening, and Alistair braced himself slightly as she approached, uncertain what judgment she might deliver. "Your Grace," she said, and then more gently, "Alistair, may I speak with you a moment?" He rose to his feet, keeping a steady hand on Theo's shoulder. "Of course, Lady Bryce." She studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes softening slightly as they moved from his face to the boy beside him. "I knew your mother well, you know. Margaret was one of the kindest women I ever had the privilege of calling family, and she loved you fiercely from the very first day she brought you into this house, whatever doubts and difficulties surrounded that arrival. I think she would be very proud of what you did here today." Alistair felt something tighten in his throat, unexpected and overwhelming. "Thank you, Lady Bryce. That means more to me than you know." "I do not say it lightly," Charlotte continued. "I have watched this family for many years, watched old grudges curdle into cruelty more times than I care to count. What Camilla said at that dinner table was unforgivable, and I told her so myself before I left that evening, though I doubt she took the lesson to heart. But you, Alistair, you have chosen honesty over hiding and love over convenience, and I do not believe that is a small thing, whatever the courts eventually decide about young Theo's inheritance." She glanced down at the boy, who studied her with the same watchful, careful eyes he turned on every new adult in his life, and her expression gentled further. "Hello, young man. I understand you are to be the future of this house." Theo glanced up at Alistair uncertainly before answering, as though checking that it was safe to speak freely. Alistair gave him a small, encouraging nod. "I suppose I am," Theo said, with careful, solemn dignity that made Charlotte smile despite herself. "Well then," she said, "I look forward to watching you grow into it. This house could use a little more honesty in its history, and I suspect you and your father together will provide plenty of it." She left shortly after, but her words stayed with Alistair long into the evening, a small, unexpected comfort amid the storm of disapproval he knew was still gathering beyond the estate's walls. Not everyone would prove so kind. He knew that already, could feel it in the whispers that had followed him out of the hall, in the pointed silence of relatives who had chosen not to approach him at all. But Charlotte's words reminded him that his father's family was not universally cruel, that somewhere beneath the old resentments and rigid expectations of noble society, there remained people capable of recognizing courage when they saw it. That night, after Theo had finally been settled into the guest chamber that would soon become permanently his own, exhausted from the long, overwhelming day, Alistair found Julian waiting for him in the library. 2 glasses of brandy already poured and waiting on the small table between the armchairs by the fire. "You did well today," Julian said, handing him one of the glasses as he sat down. "Better than well. I do not think I have ever seen that hall so thoroughly silenced." Alistair accepted the glass gratefully, sinking into the chair across from his old friend, with the particular exhaustion that comes only after holding oneself carefully composed through hours of scrutiny. "It does not feel finished, though. Camilla and Percival will not simply accept this. I could see it in their faces before they left." "No," Julian agreed. "They will not. But you have taken the first, hardest step, Alistair, and you took it without flinching. Whatever comes next, you will not face it as a man hiding behind careful silence anymore. That alone changes the shape of every battle still ahead of you." Alistair looked at him across the firelight, at the steady, familiar warmth in Julian's eyes that had carried him through so many uncertain years, and felt, despite everything still unresolved, a quiet and unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for standing beside me today. I know it was not without risk to you as well." Julian met his gaze without hesitation. "There is nowhere else I would rather stand," he said, "risk or no risk. I told you once already, Alistair, and I will keep telling you as many times as you need to hear it. I am not going anywhere." Outside, the estate settled into quiet darkness, the garden silvered under a rising moon, and somewhere in the guest chamber down the hall, Theo slept soundly for the first time in longer than he could remember, safe beneath a roof that had, at last, promised to be truly his own. The scandal that followed the family council spread through the city far faster than either Alistair or Camilla could control, carried on the tongues of servants and guests alike, until it reached every drawing room and gentlemen's club within a week. Some of society reacted with quiet sympathy, admiring the Duke's courage even as they hesitated to say so openly. Others reacted with open hostility, and within days, Alistair found himself excluded from several social gatherings he had once attended without question, his invitations quietly withdrawn by hosts unwilling to risk their own reputations by association. Percival Grey moved quickly to take advantage of the shifting mood. Working through allies in Parliament who owed him old favors, he arranged for the adoption to be raised formally before a small committee responsible for reviewing matters of noble succession, a committee with the power to delay, and potentially block entirely, the legal recognition of Theo as Alistair's rightful heir. The hearing was scheduled for a bright, cold morning 3 weeks after the family council, and by the time Alistair arrived at the Parliament building with Julian and Mr. Sinclair beside him, a small crowd of onlookers and journalists had already gathered outside, eager to witness whatever spectacle the morning might provide. Inside the chamber, 5 committee members sat behind a long, elevated table, their expressions ranging from cautious neutrality to open skepticism. Percival sat near the front of the gallery, Camilla beside him, her expression carefully composed though her hands remained tightly clasped in her lap throughout the proceedings. Alistair took his seat at the small table reserved for the party under review, Theo seated quietly beside him, dressed in the same fine coat he had worn to the family council, his small chin lifted with a careful courage that made something in Alistair's chest ache with pride. The committee chairman, a stern older man named Lord Fenwick, opened the proceedings with a brief summary of the matter before them. We are here today to examine the legitimacy of a proposed adoption within the Vane succession, and to determine whether such an adoption satisfies the conditions laid out in the late Duke's will. Objections have been raised regarding the circumstances of the child's parenthood and the process by which this adoption has proceeded. We will hear from all interested parties before rendering any judgment. Percival rose first, presenting his objections with practiced, measured confidence, referencing carefully worded documents that Henry Bramwell had prepared weeks earlier, documents suggesting irregularities in the paperwork from the orphan children's home, questions about whether proper procedure had been followed in confirming Theo's true parenthood, before his admission to Grace Ellery's care. It was a careful performance, designed to sow just enough doubt to justify a lengthy delay, and Alistair felt his stomach tighten as he watched several committee members lean forward with interest, taking notes as Percival spoke. When Percival finally sat down, Lord Fenwick turned his attention to Alistair. "Your Grace, you may respond to these concerns." Alistair rose slowly, one hand resting briefly and reassuringly on Theo's shoulder before he stepped forward to address the committee directly. "I understand the committee's need to examine this matter carefully," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the chamber upon him. "Succession is not a matter to be taken lightly, and I do not ask this committee to simply take my word without proper scrutiny. I ask only that the scrutiny be fair, and that it be based on truth rather than manufactured doubt." He gestured toward Mr. Sinclair, who rose and presented, with careful precision, the complete documentation of Theo's admission to the orphan children's home, verified records of his parents' deaths, and sworn statements from Grace Ellery herself, who had traveled to the hearing that morning specifically to testify on the boy's behalf. Mr. Sinclair walked the committee through each document methodically, addressing every question Percival had raised with clear, verifiable evidence, and slowly, Alistair watched the skeptical expressions of several committee members begin to shift toward something closer to grudging respect. It was Julian, however, who delivered the moment that would be remembered longest from that hearing. When Lord Fenwick opened the floor for any final statements before deliberation, Julian rose from his seat beside Alistair, and instead of speaking as a solicitor defending a client, he spoke as a man defending someone he loved. "My lords," Julian began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "I have known Alistair Vane since we were young men at university together, more than a decade now. In all that time, I have never known him to act with anything other than complete integrity, whether in matters of business, of family, or of the heart. I stand here today not merely as his solicitor, but as the man who has loved him for many of those years, and who intends to continue standing beside him in this chamber and beyond it for as long as he will have me." A stunned silence fell over the gallery. Camilla's hand tightened visibly on the arm of her chair, and even Percival, so carefully composed throughout the morning, could not entirely mask his surprise. Journalists in the back of the room scribbled furiously, already composing the headlines that would appear in the following morning's papers. Alistair turned to look at Julian, his own composure momentarily shaken by the unexpected declaration, though what he felt was not fear but something closer to overwhelming gratitude. Julian met his gaze steadily, unashamed, and in that moment Alistair understood the full weight of what his friend had just risked, publicly and permanently, in front of the very committee whose judgment could determine both their futures. "I do not say this to distract from the matter of young Theo's adoption," Julian continued, turning back to face the committee. "I say it because I believe this committee deserves to judge Alistair Vane based on the whole truth of who he is, not on carefully managed rumor designed to serve someone else's ambition. He is an honest man. He is a good man. And whatever this committee decides today, I do not believe honesty should be treated as a crime in this chamber or in this country." The silence that followed his words stretched long and heavy, and for a moment, Alastair feared the declaration had done more harm than good, had given the committee one more reason to doubt rather than trust. But slowly, from somewhere near the back of the gallery, a single pair of hands began to clap, quiet and deliberate, and Alastair turned to see Lady Charlotte Bryce standing among the onlookers, her sharp eyes fixed approvingly on Julian. She was not the only one. A few more scattered claps followed hers, hesitant but genuine, and though the majority of the gallery remained silent, uncertain how to react, the sound was enough to ease some of the tension that had gripped the chamber since Julian first rose to speak. Lord Fenwick called for order, though his own expression had softened slightly from its earlier sternness. "The committee will retire to consider all evidence presented today," he announced. "A judgment will be delivered within the fortnight." As the chamber began to empty, Alastair gathered Theo close, murmuring quiet reassurances as the boy, overwhelmed by the noise and tension of the morning, pressed close against his side. Julian remained near, his hand finding Alastair's shoulder in a gesture of quiet solidarity that no longer needed to hide behind the careful language of friendship. Across the chamber, Camilla watched the three of them together, the boy sheltered protectively between two men who had just risked everything, publicly and irrevocably, to stand beside him. Percival was already speaking rapidly in her ear, already calculating the next move in his scheme, already dismissing Julian's declaration as nothing more than a desperate gambit that would ultimately work in their favor by further scandalizing the family name. But Camilla found she was not truly listening to him at all. She was thinking instead of the way Alastair had looked at Julian in that unguarded moment of shock, an expression she recognized now, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, because it was the same expression she remembered her own father wearing whenever he looked at her mother in the years before her death, more than 2 decades gone but never quite forgotten. It was not scandal she was witnessing. It was love, plain and unguarded, the kind of love she had spent years telling herself her stepbrother was incapable of feeling. The old, uncomfortable splinter from the family council pressed deeper still, and for the first time since that terrible dinner, Camilla found herself unable to summon the satisfaction she had once expected to feel at her stepbrother's downfall. By the following morning, every newspaper in the city carried some version of the story, though the tone of the coverage varied wildly depending on the publication. The more traditional papers printed careful, disapproving accounts of a solicitor's shocking public declaration, warning darkly of the moral decline of noble houses, and questioning whether the committee could possibly approve an adoption surrounded by such controversy. But a handful of newer, more progressive papers took a different approach entirely, praising Julian's courage and framing Alastair's honesty as a refreshing departure from the usual hypocrisy of noble society, where private scandals were tolerated so long as they remained safely hidden behind closed doors. Alastair read through the various accounts that morning at the breakfast table, Theo, seated beside him working through a bowl of porridge with the careful concentration of a boy determined not to spill anything in front of company, while Julian read over his shoulder, occasionally making a quiet, dry comment about the more absurd claims printed in the harsher papers. "They have called me a corrupting influence," Julian noted, not without some amusement, tapping one particularly scandalized headline. "I confess I did not realize I possessed such power." "It is not funny," Alastair said, though a small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth despite himself. "Half the city will be watching us now more closely than ever." "Half the city was already watching us closely," Julian pointed out. "The only difference now is that we are no longer pretending otherwise. I find I prefer it this way, whatever the papers choose to print." Theo looked up from his porridge, his expression thoughtful. "Are people angry because you love each other?" he asked, with the blunt directness children so often possessed, unfiltered by the careful social evasions adults had spent years learning. Alastair exchanged a brief glance with Julian before answering carefully. "Some people believe love should only look one particular way, Theo, and they become uncomfortable when they see it looking different from what they expect. It does not mean anything is wrong with the love itself. It simply means those people have not yet learned to see clearly. Theo considered this with the same solemn seriousness he brought to most things, then nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the explanation, and returned to his porridge without further comment. Alistair watched him for a moment, grateful beyond words for the boy's easy, uncomplicated acceptance of a truth so many adults in the city seemed determined to treat as scandalous. Across the city, in a far less peaceful breakfast room, Camilla sat across from Percival as he read through the same newspapers with mounting frustration, his careful composure fraying visibly with each new headline he encountered. "This is a disaster," he said, tossing one paper aside with more force than necessary. "Half these papers are practically celebrating the man. If public sentiment turns in his favor, the committee may feel pressured to rule quickly in his favor simply to avoid appearing cruel." "Perhaps," Camilla said quietly, "public sentiment is turning in his favor because there is nothing truly wrong with what he has done." Percival's head snapped up, and for a moment his careful, charming mask slipped, revealing something colder and more calculating beneath it, an expression Camilla had glimpsed only rarely in their months together and had always quickly explained away. "You cannot possibly mean that, Camilla. Have you forgotten why we began this? Have you forgotten what your stepbrother has taken from you, your whole life, simply by existing in your father's house?" "I have not forgotten," Camilla said, though her voice carried less conviction than it once had. "But I watched him yesterday, Percival, standing in that chamber with that boy pressed against his side, and I watched Julian Marsh declare his love in front of the entire committee, knowing full well what it might cost him. I do not know that I have ever seen anyone risk so much simply to stand honestly beside someone else." "Sentiment," Percival said dismissively, though something guarded had entered his tone now, careful and watchful in a way it had not been before. "You are letting sentiment cloud your judgment, Camilla, at precisely the moment we need clear heads most. We are close now, closer than we have ever been. I need you to remain focused on what we agreed to, not on some newfound sympathy for the man who has spent his whole life taking your rightful place." Camilla studied him for a long moment across the breakfast table, something in his tone striking her as unfamiliar, sharper and more controlling than the warm, attentive Percival she had grown accustomed to over the past several months. "You speak as though my feelings are simply an obstacle to be managed," she said slowly. "Is that truly all they are to you?" Percival's expression softened quickly, smoothly, the charming mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Of course not, my dear. I only worry for you, for us, for the future we have planned together. I do not wish to see that future slip away simply because your stepbrother has proven himself a more skilled performer than we anticipated." Camilla accepted the reassurance, though something small and uneasy had lodged itself in her chest that would not fully dissolve, no matter how gently Percival spoke to smooth it over. She rose from the table shortly after, claiming a need for fresh air, and walked alone through the townhouse gardens for nearly an hour, turning over in her mind the image of Alistair's face in that chamber, steady and unashamed, even as his most private truth was laid bare before the entire committee. She thought again of the boy behind the drawing-room curtains, crying quietly all those years ago while she laughed and walked away. She thought of her own mother, gone now more than 20 years, and of the particular aching loneliness she remembered feeling in the years immediately after, before her father remarried. Before Alistair and his mother arrived to fill a silence Camilla had never quite admitted, even to herself. She had once desperately wanted filled by someone, anyone, willing to stay. Perhaps she allowed herself to consider for the first time in years. Alistair had felt that same aching loneliness too, arriving as a frightened boy into a house full of strangers who resented rather than welcomed him. Perhaps his gain had never truly been her loss at all, but simply two lonely children, each convinced the other represented everything wrong with their lives, when in truth they had both simply been searching, in their own separate and stubborn ways, for somewhere to finally belong. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, and she returned to the townhouse that afternoon quieter than she had been in weeks, offering only distracted responses when Percival pressed her about the next steps in their plan. Something had shifted within her during that hour alone in the garden, small and fragile still, but undeniably real, the first true crack in 20 years of carefully maintained resentment. She did not yet know how quickly that crack would widen in the weeks ahead, nor how completely her understanding of both her stepbrother and her own intended husband would be upended before the year was through. But for the first time since that terrible dinner, Camilla found herself dreading, rather than anticipating, the next phase of Percival's careful, calculating scheme. The following week, Camilla found herself with an unexpected free afternoon after Percival was called away on business. He described only vaguely as matters requiring his personal attention in the northern part of the city. Restless and unable to settle into her usual routine of letters and needlework, she instructed her driver to take her on an aimless tour through the city streets, hoping the movement might quiet the uneasy thoughts that had followed her for days. It was pure chance, or perhaps something closer to fate, that led her carriage past the small home for orphaned children on the edge of the city, just as Alistair's own carriage pulled up outside its modest gate. Camilla instructed her driver to stop a short distance away, curiosity overcoming her better judgment, and watched through the carriage window as her stepbrother stepped down and was greeted warmly at the door by a sharp-eyed woman she did not recognize. She watched him disappear inside, and after a moment of hesitation, found herself climbing down from her own carriage and approaching the building on foot, drawn by a curiosity she could not fully explain even to herself. She did not go inside immediately. Instead, she found a low garden wall along the side of the building where she could observe the small courtyard through a gap in the hedges, unseen but close enough to hear voices carrying on the still afternoon air. What she witnessed over the following hour reshaped, slowly and completely, everything she believed she understood about her stepbrother. Alistair moved through the courtyard with an ease Camilla had rarely seen him display anywhere else, crouching down to speak with a group of younger children who clustered eagerly around him, producing small wrapped sweets from his coat pocket that he distributed carefully, one to each child, along with a few quiet words that made even the shyest among them smile. He spent nearly 20 minutes with an older girl practicing her letters, patiently correcting her grip on the pencil, praising her progress with genuine warmth rather than the distant, formal encouragement Camilla might have expected from a duke visiting charity children. She watched him speak at length with the sharp-eyed matron, their conversation too quiet to overhear fully, though she caught fragments carried occasionally on the breeze, mentions of school fees for several of the older children, a new roof needed before winter medical care for a boy recovering from a fever. It became clear, listening to the easy familiarity in their exchange, that this was not Alistair's first visit, nor his 10th. This was a place he had clearly been supporting quietly for a very long time. Near the end of the visit, as Alistair prepared to leave, the matron walked him toward the gate, and Camilla, straining to hear, caught the tail end of their conversation clearly enough to understand it fully. "The Ashworth family, the ones on the eastern edge of your estate," the matron was saying. "Their eldest boy came to us last month, did you know? Their tenancy fell through after the father's accident, and they had nowhere else to send him while they got back on their feet." "I did not know," Alistair said, his expression darkening with concern. "Send word to my estate manager immediately. The Ashworth family should never have lost their tenancy in the first place, not while I hold the lease on that land. I gave up my claim to the smaller Hartwell property years ago specifically to ensure families like theirs would never be forced from their homes over a difficult season. I will speak with my manager myself and see the matter corrected before the week is out." Camilla's breath caught in her throat. She remembered, distantly, some old family conversation years earlier about Alistair relinquishing a modest inherited property, a decision she had dismissed at the time as simply another example of his careful, calculated efforts to appear generous in their father's eyes. She had never once considered that the decision might have been made quietly, without any expectation of praise or recognition, simply to protect tenant families from hardship. She remained hidden behind the hedge long after Alistair's carriage had pulled away, her mind turning over everything she had just witnessed. This was not the image of her stepbrother she had carried for 20 years, the calculating rival who had stolen her father's affection through careful performance and clever manipulation. This was a man who visited orphaned children not for public credit, since he had clearly kept the visits entirely private, but simply because he cared for them. A man who had quietly protected tenant families from hardship years before any scandal forced him to prove his character publicly. A man who had built, in the shadows and silence of his private life, exactly the kind of quiet integrity Camilla had always assumed he lacked entirely. She finally rose from her hiding place and approached the front door of the home, driven by an impulse she did not fully understand until Grace Ellery opened the door and studied her with sharp, curious eyes. "May I help you, miss?" "I am Camilla Rothford," she said, the name feeling strange and heavy in her mouth after everything she had just witnessed. "The Duke's stepsister. I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment if you have the time." Grace's expression shifted, wary now, though she stepped aside to allow Camilla into the small front hall. "I know who you are, Miss Rothford. I confess I am surprised to see you here." "As am I," Camilla admitted. "I did not intend to come. I was passing by and saw my stepbrother's carriage, and curiosity got the better of me." She hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "I have just watched him with the children here and with you. I did not know he did this, any of this." "Few people do," Grace said, studying her carefully. "He has never wanted credit for it, Miss Rothford. He funds this home almost entirely on his own, has done for nearly 5 years now, and he visits every week without fail, rain, or shine, whatever burdens the estate places on his time. He asked me once, when I offered to publicly credit his family name on our funding records, not to bother. He said he would rather the children simply feel cared for than feel like a Duke's charitable project." Camilla absorbed this in silence, the old, uncomfortable splinter of memory finally pressing all the way to the surface, sharp and undeniable now. "I have spent years believing him incapable of real kindness," she said quietly, more to herself than to Grace. "I called him unfit to lead this family, unfit to hold the title our father left him. I said terrible things about him publicly in front of dozens of people." Grace's expression did not soften entirely, though something in her sharp eyes gentled slightly. "I know what was said at that dinner, Miss Rothford. The whole city knows it. I will not pretend it did not cause him pain, because it clearly did. But I will also tell you this. In all the months since, he has never once spoken a single unkind word about you in this house. Not to me, not to the children, not even in private moments when most people would allow themselves at least a little bitterness. He has only ever spoken of protecting this family's future, whatever the cost to himself." Camilla felt something crack open fully in her chest then, the last remnants of 20 years of carefully constructed resentment, finally giving way beneath the weight of everything she had learned that afternoon. She thanked Grace quietly and left the home in a daze, walking slowly back toward her waiting carriage rather than calling for it to come to her, needing the extra moments to gather herself before facing anyone who might ask what had upset her so visibly. She did not go directly home. Instead, she instructed her driver toward the small chapel where her mother was buried, a place she visited rarely now, though she had gone often as a young girl in the years immediately following her mother's death. She sat alone beside the modest headstone for nearly an hour, turning over every memory of the past 20 years with new and uncomfortable clarity, seeing at last how much of her own bitterness had been built not on anything Alistair had truly taken from her, but on the aching, unhealed grief of a 5-year-old girl who had simply wanted her mother back, and had never known how to grieve that loss without finding someone else to blame for it. When she finally returned to the townhouse that evening, Percival was waiting for her in the drawing room, freshly returned from his own business in the northern part of the city, his expression brightening as she entered. "There you are," he said. "I have excellent news. The committee's private secretary has confirmed, quietly, that at least 2 of the 5 members remain genuinely uncertain about the adoption's legitimacy. If we press just a little further, provide just a little more carefully placed doubt, I believe we can still secure a delay in our favor, perhaps even an outright denial. Camilla studied him for a long moment, seeing him now with the same unsettling new clarity that had reshaped her understanding of Alistair that afternoon. She thought of Henry Bramwell's forged documents, of the careful, calculating way Percival had encouraged her cruelty at that terrible dinner, of the cold, controlling edge that had crept into his voice the moment she expressed even the smallest doubt about their scheme. "Percival," she said slowly, "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. What happens to me in your plans once the estate is secured? What role do you truly intend for me to play once you are Duke?" Percival's expression flickered just briefly, with something guarded and calculating before the charming mask slid back into place. "You will be my wife, Camilla, mistress of a great estate, exactly as we have always planned." "That is not an answer," Camilla said quietly. "That is a description of a title, not a partnership. I have watched my stepbrother today build a family out of nothing more than honesty and choice, risking his entire reputation to protect a boy he loves as his own son. I find myself wondering, Percival, whether you have ever once considered my happiness as anything other than a convenient path toward your own ambitions." "You are overwrought," Percival said, his voice tightening with the first open edge of frustration Camilla had ever heard from him. "This is not the time for sentiment, Camilla. We are close to everything we have worked toward. I need you steady, not questioning every careful step at the moment it matters most." Camilla studied him in silence, and for the first time in their months together, she found herself truly seeing him clearly, stripped of the flattering attention and careful charm he had always wrapped so skillfully around his own ambitions. She said nothing further that evening, retiring early with a headache she did not entirely feign, but she lay awake long into the night turning over every conversation, every careful manipulation, every moment she had mistaken control for devotion. By morning, the shape of a very different plan had begun to form in her mind, one that had nothing at all to do with securing an estate through scheme and forgery, and everything to do with finally, after 20 years, choosing honesty over old bitterness before it cost her everything that still mattered. The next morning, Camilla rose early, before the household had fully stirred, and sat at her writing desk with a blank sheet of paper before her for nearly an hour without setting pen to it. She wanted to write to Alistair, wanted to say something that might begin to undo 20 years of cruelty and misunderstanding, but every sentence she attempted felt either too small for what she owed him or too large to survive the fear still knotted tightly in her chest. What if he refused to read it? What if he read it and felt nothing but the old, justified anger she had given him every reason to hold on to? She thought of Theo instead, of the careful, solemn way he had stood beside Alistair at the family council, already learning at 8 years old what it meant to be quietly and completely loved. She thought of her own childhood, of the years she had spent convinced that love was a limited resource, that any affection shown to Alistair was affection stolen directly from her own share. She understood now, with the particular clarity that comes only from confronting an old wound honestly for the first time, that she had built her entire adult life around a lie. A frightened, grieving child had once told herself simply to make sense of an unbearable loss. She set the pen down finally without writing a single word, deciding that whatever she owed her stepbrother deserved to be spoken plainly, face to face, rather than hidden safely behind the careful distance of a letter. But she was not yet ready, not while Percival's scheme still hung unresolved over the family, not while she remained uncertain how deeply she herself had already been complicit in the harm still threatening to unfold. She spent the following days in careful, quiet observation, watching Percival more closely than she ever had before, noting the late-night meetings he claimed were simple business, the increasingly evasive answers he gave whenever she asked directly about the details of his plan to discredit the adoption. She began, slowly and deliberately, to distance herself from his schemes without yet openly confronting him, offering vague excuses when he pressed her for further assistance, claiming exhaustion, claiming caution, claiming anything that might buy her time to understand fully what she had allowed herself to become entangled in. It was during one of these quiet evenings, alone in her sitting room while Percival attended to business elsewhere, that a letter arrived unexpectedly, delivered by a servant who explained only that it had come from the Vane estate. Camilla's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, uncertain what to expect, and found inside a short, careful note written in Alastair's familiar, precise handwriting. Camilla, it began, without any formal address, without any of the cold distance she might have expected after everything that had passed between them. I do not know what prompted your visit to the children's home last week, though Grace mentioned it to me, and I confess I have thought of little else since. I do not write to demand an explanation, nor to reopen old wounds neither of us has fully healed from. I write only to say that whatever has passed between us, you remain my sister, and my door remains open to you, whenever you are ready to walk through it honestly. Alastair. Camilla read the letter 3 times before she finally allowed herself to cry, quietly and completely, releasing 20 years of carefully guarded resentment in the privacy of her own sitting room. She had expected anger from him, had perhaps even wanted it, some clear and simple justification for the guilt now sitting heavily in her chest. Instead, he had offered her exactly what he had offered Theo at the orphan children's home, exactly what he had offered Julian in that Parliament chamber. An open, unguarded invitation to be honestly and completely known, without condition, without demand. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small drawer of her writing desk, where she kept the few possessions that still connected her to her mother, a modest collection of letters and a small portrait, treasures she had protected fiercely through every difficult year since her mother's death. It felt right, somehow, to place Alastair's letter alongside them, the first honest thing anyone in her family had offered her in longer than she cared to admit. She did not yet know how quickly the fragile peace of that evening would be shattered, nor how soon Percival's careful scheme would finally begin to unravel in ways neither of them had anticipated. But for the first time in 20 years, Camilla went to bed that night with something lighter in her chest than the old, familiar weight of bitterness she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten what its absence felt like. The unraveling began not with any grand confrontation, but with a small, careless mistake made by a frightened clerk trying to protect his own family from consequences he had never fully anticipated. Henry Bramwell, growing increasingly uneasy about the forged documents he had prepared for Percival Gray, made the decision one evening to quietly copy the original correspondence between himself and his employer, intending to keep proof of exactly what he had been asked to do, insurance against the day Percival might decide his usefulness had ended, and his silence needed to be purchased more permanently. Henry's caution proved wise, though not in the way he expected. 2 days after copying the letters, a fire broke out in the building above the bookshop where his small office was located, started accidentally by a careless tenant on the floor above, and in the chaos of the evacuation, several of Henry's papers were scattered into the street before the fire brigade could fully contain the blaze. Among the scattered papers, a young clerk from Mr. Sinclair's own office, walking past on an errand, recognized Percival Gray's distinctive seal on one partially burned letter, and out of simple curiosity, retrieved it from the gutter before continuing on his way. The letter found its way to Mr. Sinclair's desk within the hour, and by that evening, the elderly lawyer sat across from Alastair in the estate study, laying out the damning evidence with grave and careful precision. "This appears to be correspondence between Lord Gray and a clerk named Henry Bramwell," Mr. Sinclair said, sliding the singed paper across the desk. "The surviving portion references payment for, and I quote directly, questions sufficient to delay court approval. Given the timing, and given everything Lord Gray has presented before the committee, I believe we may finally have concrete evidence of exactly what has been happening behind this entire matter." Alastair read the letter twice, his expression darkening with a controlled anger he rarely allowed himself to show. "I need to speak with this clerk directly," he said. "If he can be persuaded to testify honestly about what he was asked to do, and why, This could end Percival's scheme entirely, and quite possibly end his standing in society altogether. It did not take long to locate Henry Bramwell. Still shaken from the fire and increasingly frightened about what consequences might follow from the scattered papers he could not fully account for. When Mr. Sinclair and Alastair arrived at his temporary lodgings the following morning, they found a man already close to breaking under the weight of guilt he had carried quietly for weeks. "I did not want to do it," Henry admitted almost immediately, his hands twisting nervously in his lap as he sat across from them in the small, borrowed room. "But my family needed the money, and Lord Grey made it clear my continued silence would be well compensated, while any hesitation on my part would not be received kindly. I have copies of everything, sir, every letter, every instruction. I kept them thinking I might need them one day to protect myself." He produced the copies from a small locked box he had kept hidden beneath his bed, and Mr. Sinclair reviewed them carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is more than sufficient," he said finally. "Properly presented before the committee, this will not only end the challenge to Theo's adoption. It will very likely end Lord Grey's standing before Parliament entirely, and may well result in criminal charges for fraud." Henry paled visibly at the mention of criminal charges, and Alastair studied him for a long moment before speaking again, his anger toward Percival tempered by a clear understanding of the desperate circumstances that had driven a frightened man to such a decision. "I have no wish to see you ruined for another man's ambition, Mr. Bramwell. If you testify honestly and fully before the committee, and cooperate completely with whatever investigation follows, I will personally see that leniency is requested on your behalf, and that your family does not suffer further for this mistake." Relief flooded across Henry's face, and he nodded quickly, gratefully. "I will testify, Your Grace. I will tell them everything." The committee reconvened 3 days later, and this time the chamber was packed even more tightly than before, word having spread quickly through the city that something significant had shifted in the matter of the Vane adoption. Percival arrived confident and composed as always, though something in his expression tightened when he noticed Henry Bramwell seated quietly near Mr. Sinclair, his eyes carefully avoiding Percival's gaze from across the chamber. Camilla arrived separately that morning, choosing to sit near the back of the gallery rather than beside Percival as she had at the previous hearing, a small but deliberate distance that did not go unnoticed by those close enough to observe it. She had told Percival only that she preferred to observe from a quieter vantage point, offering no further explanation, though the truth was far more complicated than she was yet ready to speak aloud. Lord Fenwick opened the proceedings, and Mr. Sinclair rose almost immediately, presenting the newly discovered evidence with careful, devastating precision. Henry Bramwell was called to testify, and though his voice trembled through much of his account, he spoke clearly and completely about every document he had forged, every payment he had received, every instruction Percival Grey had given him over the preceding weeks. The chamber erupted into shocked murmurs as the full scope of the scheme became clear, and Percival's carefully maintained composure finally cracked entirely under the weight of the mounting evidence against him. He rose, attempting to salvage some defense, claiming Henry's testimony was the desperate fabrication of a man seeking to escape his own culpability. But the physical evidence of the letters, combined with Henry's detailed and consistent account, left little room for the committee to entertain any doubt. "This committee finds sufficient evidence of deliberate fraud committed against the legitimate process of this hearing," Lord Fenwick announced finally, his voice carrying grave authority through the hushed chamber. "Lord Percival Grey's objections to the Vane adoption are hereby dismissed in their entirety, and this matter will be referred immediately to the appropriate authorities for further investigation into criminal fraud." Percival was escorted from the chamber under the watchful eyes of Parliament officials, his reputation, so carefully cultivated over years of calculated charm, collapsing entirely within the space of a single devastating morning. He did not look back as he was led away, though Camilla, watching from her seat near the back of the gallery, felt no satisfaction at his downfall, Only a heavy, sobering understanding of how completely she had allowed herself to be drawn into his ambitions, and how narrowly she had escaped being consumed entirely by them. The committee's official ruling on the adoption itself followed swiftly. With Percival's challenge dismissed and his fraud exposed, the committee found no remaining grounds to delay their judgment further, and Lord Fenwick declared the adoption fully and legally approved before the chamber adjourned that afternoon. Theo, who had not been present for the hearing at Alastair's insistence, spared from the tension of the proceedings, would learn the news that evening in the quiet comfort of his own home, surrounded by the family that had chosen him. As the chamber slowly emptied, Camilla remained seated, uncertain and hesitant, watching Alastair accept quiet congratulations from Mr. Sinclair and a visibly relieved Julian. She rose finally, gathering what courage remained after the emotional weight of the morning, and made her way slowly toward her stepbrother, unsure whether he would even wish to speak with her after everything that had happened between them. Alastair noticed her approach before she reached him, and something careful and uncertain passed across his own expression as their eyes met, 20 years of complicated history hanging unresolved in the space between them. "Camilla," he said quietly, when she finally stood before him. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice unsteady in a way she rarely allowed it to be in public. "Not here, not with everyone watching. Somewhere private, if you would allow it." Alastair studied her for a long moment, and Julian, sensing the delicate weight of the moment, quietly excused himself with Theo's welfare as a gentle pretext, leaving the two of them alone near the emptying chamber doors. "I did not know about Percival's scheme," Camilla said quickly, before her courage could fail her entirely. "Not the forgery, not the payments to that clerk. I want you to believe that, though I understand if you cannot, given everything else I am responsible for." "I believe you," Alastair said quietly, and something in Camilla's chest loosened slightly at the simple, unguarded honesty in his voice. "Percival is the kind of man who keeps his darkest schemes carefully hidden even from those closest to him. I do not believe you would have condoned outright forgery and fraud, whatever cruelty you allowed yourself at that dinner table." Camilla flinched slightly at the reminder, though she did not look away. "I am sorry, Alastair, truly, completely sorry for that dinner, and for 20 years of resentment I built on a foundation that was never truly your fault. I visited the children's home last week, quite by accident, and I watched you with those children, and I heard what Grace told me about the Ashworth family, about years of quiet kindness I never once gave you credit for. I have spent my whole life believing you took everything from me, when the truth is I simply never allowed myself to see you clearly enough to understand what you had actually built, quietly and honestly, while I remained too bitter to notice." Alastair listened in silence, his expression carefully guarded but not unkind, and when she finally finished, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I forgive you, Camilla," he said finally. "Not because what you said at that dinner did not hurt, because it did deeply. But because I understand now, more than I once did, how much grief shaped both of us differently after our parents' deaths, and how easily grief can curdle into resentment when it is never properly given room to heal. I do not wish to spend whatever years remain to us as strangers who happen to share a family name." Relief and gratitude flooded through Camilla so completely that tears finally spilled freely down her cheeks, unguarded in a way she had not allowed herself to be in years. "What happens to Percival now?" she asked, once she had composed herself slightly. "The authorities will handle the matter of his fraud," Alastair said. "As for the rest, whatever consequences follow from his scheme becoming public, I imagine society will be far less forgiving of him than I have chosen to be of you." Camilla nodded slowly, understanding the distinction clearly, and grateful more than she could properly express, for the mercy her stepbrother had chosen to extend her despite every reason he had to withhold it entirely. In the weeks that followed, as the scandal of Percival's fraud spread through the city with the same speed the earlier scandal of Alastair's private life once had, Camilla found herself facing a different kind of exposure entirely. Whispers began to circulate questioning how much she had known, how deeply she had been involved in the scheme that had nearly cost her stepbrother everything. And several of her closest social connections quietly began distancing themselves, unwilling to risk association with a woman so publicly entangled with a disgraced fraudster. Alastair, learning of the growing rumors through Mr. Sinclair, did something Camilla had not expected and had certainly not asked of him. He requested a private meeting with the same committee that had ruled on Theo's adoption, and though the meeting concerned matters entirely separate from the succession, he used the opportunity to speak plainly on his stepsister's behalf, confirming publicly that she had played no role in the forgery or fraud, that whatever poor judgment she had shown in her association with Percival Gray, she had acted honestly the moment the truth became clear to her, cooperating fully with the investigation, rather than attempting to protect a man who had used her ambitions for his own gain. His testimony, delivered with the same quiet, unshakable integrity that had carried him through every previous trial that year, proved sufficient to quiet most of the harsher rumors circulating against her. When Camilla learned what he had done, she went to him immediately, finding him in the estate's garden where he often walked in the quiet hours of early evening. "You did not have to defend me," she said, still slightly breathless from the speed of her arrival. "After everything, you did not owe me that." "I did not do it because I owed it to you," Alastair said, continuing his slow walk along the garden path, Camilla falling into step beside him. "I did it because you are my sister, and because I believe you deserve the chance to build an honest life free of Percival's shadow, the same chance you helped me claim for myself, however unintentionally, when your cruelty forced me to finally stop hiding." Camilla absorbed this in thoughtful silence for a long moment. "I do not entirely understand how you can be so generous toward someone who caused you so much pain. Perhaps because I understand now, more clearly than I ever have, how much of that pain grew from our shared history rather than from any true malice in your heart," Alastair said. "We were both children shaped by loss, Camilla, taught far too early that love could be taken away without warning. I spent years hiding from the world to protect myself from that fear. You spent years lashing out at me for the same reason. Neither of us chose that fear consciously. I would rather spend whatever years remain building something better than continuing to punish each other for wounds neither of us fully understood until now." They walked together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the golden evening light settling gently over the gardens, and for the first time in either of their memories, the space between them felt less like a battlefield long contested, and more like the quiet, uncertain beginning of something neither had ever truly allowed themselves to hope for. A genuine, honest family bond finally taking root after 20 years of careful, painful distance. Spring arrived at the Vane estate with an unusual softness that year, the gardens blooming earlier than anyone could remember, as though the grounds themselves had absorbed some of the lightness that had finally settled over the household after so many months of scandal and uncertainty. Theo's formal adoption had been fully recognized by the courts for nearly 4 months now. His name entered permanently into the family record as heir to the estate, and the initial storm of gossip that had once followed the family everywhere had gradually settled into a quieter, more accepting curiosity that occasionally still surfaced at social gatherings, but no longer carried the same sharp edge of scandal it once had. Percival Gray's trial for fraud had concluded the previous month, resulting in a lengthy prison sentence and the complete collapse of what remained of his social standing. Camilla had testified against him with steady, unflinching honesty, describing clearly and without excuse the manipulation she had allowed herself to become entangled in, careful never to shift blame away from her own choices, even as she explained how thoroughly Percival had exploited her old grievances for his own ambition. The city's sympathy, once so sharply divided, had shifted decisively in her favor by the trial's conclusion, most people recognizing in her honest, unflinching testimony a woman genuinely working to repair the damage of her own poor judgment, rather than a co-conspirator seeking merely to escape consequence. Camilla had chosen, in the months since, not to pursue any further attempt at marriage or social advancement, focusing instead on rebuilding her own sense of purpose independent of the old ambitions that had driven her for so many years. She had taken an increasingly active role in supporting the children's home Alastair funded, discovering in the work an unexpected satisfaction that no amount of social status had ever quite provided her. Grace Ellery, initially wary of her involvement given the family's complicated history, had grown to trust her steadily over the months, and the two women now worked together with genuine warmth on expanding the home's modest facilities. On a particularly bright Sunday afternoon in early spring, the family gathered in the estate's largest drawing room for an occasion that would have seemed impossible to imagine only a year earlier. A portrait painter, commissioned months in advance by Alastair himself, had arrived to capture the household as it now stood. A formal family portrait intended to hang alongside the generations of Vane ancestors, whose painted faces already lined the estate's long gallery. Theo stood at the center of the arrangement, dressed in a fine blue coat that Mrs. Whitfield had spent considerable care selecting. His dark hair combed neatly, though it had already begun to fall slightly across his forehead within minutes of the painter's arrival. Beside him stood Alastair, one hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder, and beside Alastair, close enough that their positioning in the portrait would leave little room for society to misunderstand the nature of their relationship, stood Julian, dressed formally for the occasion, his expression carrying the same quiet warmth he had shown from the very first day Alastair had introduced him properly to the household as more than simply a solicitor and old friend. Camilla stood slightly apart from the three of them, though not distant, positioned deliberately by Alastair's careful instruction to the painter as clearly and unmistakably part of the family grouping, rather than a separate figure standing at its edge. She had hesitated when he first suggested including her in the formal portrait, uncertain whether she had truly earned a place in this new, honest family Alastair had built. But he had insisted gently, reminding her that family, properly understood, was built through choice and commitment rather than simple obligation, and that he chose, freely and completely, to consider her part of his family still. "Hold still now, Your Grace," the painter instructed, not for the first time, as Theo shifted restlessly beneath the weight of standing motionless for so long. "Just a little longer." "He has been saying that for an hour," Theo complained quietly to Alastair, though he obediently straightened his posture once more. "Patience is its own kind of courage," Alastair said, with the particular gentle humor he had grown increasingly comfortable expressing since Theo's arrival had brought unexpected lightness into a household that had, for so many years before, carried itself with careful, guarded formality. "You have shown a great deal of courage already this year, Theo. A little more patience should not prove too difficult a challenge." Theo considered this seriously, as he considered most things, then nodded and held his position more steadily, though his eyes drifted occasionally toward Julian, who caught his gaze and offered a small, encouraging wink that made the boy's careful composure crack briefly into a genuine smile, one the painter captured perfectly in the finished portrait weeks later. As the sitting continued, Camilla found her thoughts drifting back over the long, difficult year that had led to this quiet, unexpected afternoon. She thought of the terrible dinner that had set everything in motion, of her own cruel words spoken in front of dozens of witnesses, words she still carried the weight of even now, months into a genuine and ongoing effort to repair what she had broken. She thought of the quiet courtyard where she had first witnessed Alastair's hidden kindness toward children who had no one else to depend on, of the letter that had arrived at exactly the moment she needed it most, offering forgiveness she had not yet believed herself to deserve. She thought, too, of her own mother, gone now more than 20 years, and wondered, not for the first time, what she might have thought of the woman Camilla had become in the years since her death, first hardened by grief and resentment, and now, slowly and imperfectly, rebuilding herself into someone capable of honest love rather than bitter comparison. She liked to believe her mother would have understood, would have recognized in Alastair's steady, unflinching kindness exactly the kind of family bond she herself would have wanted for her daughter, had circumstances allowed her the years to see it fully realized. The portrait sitting finally concluded as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, and the painter promised the finished work within a fortnight, packing away his supplies, while the family drifted from formal poses back into the comfortable, easy movement of ordinary life. Theo immediately abandoned his careful posture to chase after one of the estate's dogs across the drawing room, earning a gentle but affectionate reprimand from Mrs. Whitfield about proper indoor behavior that he only half listened to, already laughing too freely to fully register the scolding. Julian caught Alistair's eye across the room, and something passed between them, warm and unguarded, the particular ease of two people who had spent years hiding an important part of themselves, finally allowed to simply exist together without pretense or careful management. Alistair crossed the room to stand beside him, and Julian reached for his hand without hesitation, without the old caution that had once governed every small gesture of affection between them in public spaces. "It is a strange thing," Alistair said quietly, watching Theo continue his energetic pursuit of the estate dog across the drawing-room floor, Camilla now laughing openly as she attempted to help corner the excited animal near the far wall. "A year ago, I could not have imagined any of this. Not you standing beside me so openly. Not Theo filling this house with noise I once thought it would never hold again. Not Camilla laughing in this room rather than looking for ways to wound me in it. A year ago, you were still hiding from yourself as much as from anyone else," Julian said gently, his thumb tracing a small, familiar circle against the back of Alistair's hand. "It took courage to stop, more courage than most people ever find in an entire lifetime. It took Camilla's cruelty to force that courage into the open," Alistair admitted. "I am not certain I would have found it on my own, left to my own careful, patient hiding." "Perhaps not," Julian allowed. "But you found it, however painfully it arrived, and you built something remarkable from it. That matters more than how the courage first found its way to you." Alistair considered this, watching his family, his true, chosen family, filling the drawing room with warmth and laughter that would have seemed impossible to imagine only 12 months earlier, and found himself, for perhaps the first time in his entire adult life, entirely at peace with exactly who he was and exactly what he had built. That evening, after Theo had finally exhausted himself thoroughly enough to be settled peacefully into bed, and Camilla had returned to her own townhouse with a promise to visit again within the week, Alistair and Julian sat together in the quiet of the library, the same room where their careful, guarded friendship had first begun to shift, months earlier, into something neither of them had dared name aloud at the time. "I have been thinking," Alistair said, after a comfortable silence had settled between them, "about what comes next for us." Julian raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you have in mind?" "I do not wish to continue hiding any part of my life, Julian, not after everything this past year has taught me. I would like the world to know plainly and permanently what you already mean to me, not simply as friend and solicitor, careful language we have relied on for far too many years already, but as the man I have chosen to build my life alongside, publicly and completely." Julian's expression softened with quiet, overwhelming affection. "You are certain? The scandal has only just begun to settle, Alistair. This would reopen it entirely." "I am certain," Alistair said, without hesitation. "I spent 30 years afraid of exactly this kind of certainty, afraid of what the world might say if I ever allowed myself to want something so completely. I am no longer interested in living that way. Theo deserves to grow up watching two people who love each other honestly, without shame, without careful hiding behind polite fictions. And I find, quite simply, that I want the same thing for myself." Julian reached across the small space between their chairs and took Alistair's hand once more, holding it firmly. "Then whatever comes of it, scandal or acceptance or something uncertain in between, I will stand beside you exactly as I have stood beside you through everything else this year. That has never once been in question, Alistair, not from the very first day we met." Outside the library window, the estate settled into peaceful evening quiet, the garden silvered gently under a rising moon, and somewhere within the great house, a small boy slept soundly, safe and certain of his place in a family finally built on nothing but honesty. And two men sat together in comfortable, unguarded silence, having finally, after so many careful years, allowed themselves to simply belong to each other in the open light, rather than the protective shadows they had once believed necessary for survival. The following spring, when the newly finished family portrait was hung at last in the estate's long gallery, alongside generations of solemn, formally posed ancestors, visitors to the house often paused before it longer than any of the older paintings, struck by something unusual in its composition, a warmth and easy closeness rarely captured in such formal family portraiture. Theo's small hand rested on Alastair's arm rather than standing stiffly apart from him. Julian stood close enough that no honest observer could mistake his position as anything other than family. And Camilla, positioned deliberately within the group rather than at its careful edge, wore an expression of genuine, unguarded warmth that anyone who had known her in earlier years would scarcely have recognized. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate identified the family simply, without elaborate titles or lengthy inscription. It read only their names, side by side, exactly as Alastair had insisted it should, a quiet, permanent testament to a family built not through the accident of blood or the demands of old succession clauses, but through the harder, more honest work of choosing each other, openly and completely, whatever the world outside their gardens still had to say about it. The public announcement, when it finally came, arrived not through any dramatic declaration before Parliament or scandalized headline in the morning papers, but through a simple, quiet invitation extended to the family's closest connections, informing them that the Duke intended to formally recognize Julian Marsh as his permanent companion and partner in all matters, personal and otherwise, at a modest gathering held in the estate's gardens the following month. Some declined the invitation quietly, unwilling still to fully accept what such recognition represented. But far more accepted than either Alastair or Julian had dared to expect, arriving on a warm afternoon in early summer to stand among roses in full bloom and witness, openly and without pretense, the kind of devotion that had waited far too many years to be spoken plainly. Lady Charlotte Bryce arrived early, as she had promised she would, and spent much of the afternoon in animated conversation with Grace Ellery, the two sharp-tongued women discovering in each other an immediate and lasting friendship built on mutual respect for plain speaking. Mr. Sinclair attended as well, quietly proud of the family he had served faithfully through so many difficult months, and even a handful of committee members from the earlier hearings made brief, respectful appearances, their earlier skepticism softened considerably by everything that had unfolded since. Theo, now approaching his 9th birthday, had grown noticeably more confident in the months since his adoption, the watchful caution that had once defined his every interaction gradually giving way to the easier, more open manner of a child who had finally learned to trust that his place in the world was secure. He had begun attending a small private school near the estate that spring, and though the other children had initially treated him with the same wary curiosity that had followed the entire family through the year's scandals, his quiet, steady confidence, so clearly modeled after Alastair's own example, had gradually won him genuine friendships among his classmates. There had been one difficult afternoon, several weeks into the term, when an older boy had mocked him cruelly in the schoolyard, repeating some garbled version of the gossip his own parents had discussed at home regarding the unconventional nature of Theo's family. Theo had come home that day quieter than usual, and it was Camilla, visiting for tea that afternoon, who first noticed something troubling him. "What is it?" she asked gently, finding him alone in the garden rather than playing as he usually did upon returning from school. Theo hesitated for a long moment before answering. "A boy at school said my family is strange. He said Papa should be ashamed of loving Julian instead of finding a proper wife." Camilla felt an old, familiar anger rise in her chest, though tempered now by the gentler understanding she had worked so hard to cultivate over the past year. She sat down beside him on the garden bench, choosing her words carefully. "Do you believe your family is something to be ashamed of, Theo?" He shook his head slowly, though uncertainty still shadowed his young face. "No, but it is hard when other people say unkind things." "It is very hard," Camilla agreed. I know that better than almost anyone, because I was once the person saying unkind things myself, to your father, at a dinner table full of people who should have known better than to let me speak so cruelly. I have spent a great deal of time since then learning how much damage unkind words can cause, and how much courage it takes to remain steady in the face of them, exactly as your father remained steady that night, and exactly as you are learning to remain steady now. Theo considered this seriously. You said unkind things to Papa. I did, Camilla admitted, without flinching from the shame of it. Terrible things in front of many people, because I did not yet understand how much my own old hurts had twisted my heart against him. I am not proud of that day, Theo, but I am proud of what your father chose to do afterward, and I am proud of what our whole family has built since, despite everything I once tried to tear down. Theo absorbed this quietly, then finally allowed a small, tentative smile. The boy at school does not know Papa the way we do. No, Camilla agreed, smiling back at him with genuine warmth. He does not, and in time most people who matter will come to understand exactly what kind of family you belong to, Theo, one built on honesty and courage rather than fear of what others might say. That is worth far more than any unkind words a schoolyard bully might offer. When Alistair learned of the conversation later that evening, he found Camilla in the drawing room and studied her for a long moment with quiet, grateful warmth. "Thank you," he said simply, "for comforting him." "He is my nephew," Camilla said, as though the answer required no further explanation. "And you are my brother, whatever cruel things I once said to deny it. I intend to spend whatever years remain proving that truth to both of you, for as long as it takes." By the time the summer gathering finally arrived, Theo had regained his usual confidence, running freely through the garden with Grace Ellery's own visiting nephew, the earlier schoolyard unkindness already fading into the ordinary, forgettable friction of childhood rather than any lasting wound. The formal announcement itself was brief and unadorned, Alistair simply raising a glass among the gathered guests to speak, without excessive ceremony, of the family he had built through courage rather than convenience, and of the partner who had stood steadily beside him through every difficulty the past year had demanded. As the golden summer evening settled gently over the estate, the gardens filled with quiet conversation and easy laughter, Alistair found himself standing beside Julian near the old rose beds his mother had planted decades earlier, watching Theo and Camilla together near the garden's edge, watching Mr. Sinclair in animated conversation with Charlotte and Grace, watching an entire family, imperfect and hard one, finally settled into something honest and lasting. "Any regrets?" Julian asked quietly, following his gaze. Alistair considered the question seriously, thinking of the terrible dinner that had begun it all, of every difficult month that had followed, of every risk taken, and every fear finally faced. "None," he said finally, taking Julian's hand in the fading evening light without any hesitation at all. "Not a single one." 5 years passed at the Vane estate, and the gardens that had once witnessed so much quiet grief and careful hiding now rang regularly with the sound of genuine laughter, filling the great house with a warmth it had not known in generations. Theo, now 13 and taller than anyone expected for his age, had grown into a thoughtful, steady young man who carried himself with the same quiet dignity his father had shown throughout that difficult first year, though he had also developed a sharp, easy humor entirely his own, one that often left even the household's more formal guests laughing despite themselves. He had taken a genuine interest in the estate's management, spending long afternoons with Alistair reviewing tenant agreements and harvest records, absorbing lessons in responsibility and fairness that would serve him well when the title eventually passed to him. He had also, much to Grace Ellery's quiet delight, developed a habit of visiting the children's home on his own initiative, without any prompting from his father, having grown up understanding intimately what it meant to be a child without a settled place in the world, and determined now to offer that same steady comfort to others still searching for it. Camilla had never remarried, choosing instead to build a life centered on her expanding work at the children's home, which had grown considerably under her, and Grace's combined leadership, now sheltering nearly 3 times as many children as it had in its earlier, more modest years. She visited the estate often, close enough to Theo now that he considered her less an aunt and more something closer to a second mother, a role she had never expected to hold but had come, over the years, to cherish more deeply than any title or marriage she had once believed necessary for her own happiness. She thought sometimes of Percival Gray, whose long prison sentence had recently concluded, though she felt, when she allowed herself to consider him at all, only a distant, faded sorrow rather than any lingering anger. She had heard he had left the city entirely upon his release, seeking some quieter life far from the society whose favor he had once schemed so relentlessly to secure. She wished him, in the end, nothing more than the same hard-won peace she herself had finally found, though she doubted he would ever fully understand how much simpler that peace might have come to him, had he only chosen honesty over ambition from the very beginning. Julian and Alastair's partnership had, over the years, grown into something the wider city had largely come to accept, if not always celebrate. There remained corners of society that still whispered disapprovingly, still declined certain invitations, still spoke in careful, coded language about the unconventional nature of the Vane household. But far more had come, gradually and genuinely, to admire the steady, unshaken devotion the two men had shown each other through every difficulty, and a new generation of young nobility, watching the example the family had set, had begun to speak more openly themselves about truths they might once have felt compelled to hide entirely. Mr. Sinclair had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, having lived long enough to see the succession he had helped secure fully settled and thriving, and Alastair had spoken at his memorial with genuine grief for a man who had quietly helped reshape the entire course of his family's future. Lady Charlotte Bryce, well into her later years now, still visited the estate regularly, her sharp tongue undulled by age, still finding endless amusement in recounting to visiting guests the story of the family council where she had first witnessed, as she liked to describe it, an entire room of noble cowards finally shamed into silence by one honest man's courage. On a warm autumn afternoon, much like the one that had marked the very beginning of everything, 5 years after that terrible dinner had first set the family's transformation into motion, Alastair stood once more in the estate's long gallery, studying the family portrait that had hung there now for years, its colors still vivid, its warmth still evident to every visitor who paused before it. Theo found him there, home briefly from his studies, and came to stand beside him, taller now than the boy captured so carefully in that painted afternoon. "Do you ever think about that dinner?" Theo asked, following his father's gaze toward the portrait. "The one where Aunt Camilla said those things." Alastair considered the question thoughtfully, as he considered most things Theo asked him now, treating even his son's simplest curiosities with the same careful respect he had always shown him. "I do, sometimes," he admitted, "though not with the pain it once caused me. I think of it now mostly as the beginning of everything that followed, the moment I finally stopped hiding from the truth of who I was. It was a painful beginning, but it led us here to this house, to this family, to you." Theo studied the portrait a moment longer, his eyes moving over each familiar face, his own younger self standing solemnly at its center, Julian's steady presence beside Alastair, Camilla's genuine warmth finally captured after so many years of careful distance. "I am glad she said it," he said finally, surprising his father slightly with the simple honesty of the observation. "Not because it was right for her to say something so cruel, but because if she had not, I do not know that any of this would have happened. You might never have adopted me. Julian might still be hiding as simply your solicitor rather than standing here as my other father. Aunt Camilla might still be lost in all that old bitterness, rather than the woman who taught me to read my first proper book at the children's home." Alastair rested a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, struck, not for the first time, by how much wisdom the boy had gathered in his relatively short years, wisdom born of understanding early and completely what it meant to nearly lose everything before finally finding a true and lasting home. "Pain does not excuse cruelty," he said quietly. "But sometimes, If we are fortunate and if we are brave enough, something honest and lasting can still grow from even the most painful beginnings. That has been the great lesson of these past 5 years. Theo, more than any lesson of estate management or noble duty I have tried to teach you. Courage matters more than comfort. Honesty matters more than easy silence. And family, real family, is built through choice and forgiveness far more than through blood or old obligation. Theo nodded slowly, absorbing the words with the same solemn seriousness he had carried since the very first day Alastair had met him in the quiet courtyard of Grace Ellery's home. The warmth and easy confidence had long since softened that early caution into something gentler and more settled. Outside the gallery windows, the autumn gardens stretched toward the horizon in brilliant gold and amber. The same gardens where Alastair had once walked alone in shame after that terrible dinner, uncertain whether he would ever find the courage to live honestly in his own home. He had found that courage, slowly and painfully, and in finding it, had built a family far richer and far more honest than the one he had feared losing that difficult night. That evening, the family gathered together in the drawing room as they often did now, Julian reading quietly by the fire, Theo working through his studies at the small writing desk near the window, Camilla visiting for dinner as she frequently did these days. The easy warmth between them all a testament to everything they had chosen to build together over the years since that painful, transformative beginning. Alastair watched them from his own chair near the fire, and felt, as he often did now in these quiet evening hours, a deep and settled gratitude for the strange, difficult path that had led him here. His stepsister's cruelty had once threatened to destroy everything he valued. Instead, faced honestly and met with courage rather than shame, it had become the unlikely catalyst for building something far more genuine than the careful, hidden life he had once believed was the only safety available to him. The Duke, who had once been mocked as unfit to lead his family, too broken by his own nature to ever secure its future, had instead built exactly the kind of legacy his father had always hoped for, not through blood or convenient marriage, but through the harder, more honest work of choosing love openly, protecting the vulnerable fiercely, and forgiving even the deepest wounds when genuine change proved itself worthy of that forgiveness. It was, in the end, precisely the surprise his stepsister had never expected on that terrible night so many years earlier, though it had taken years for its full shape to become clear even to Alastair himself. She had mocked him for what she believed made him unfit to lead, and in answer, he had built a family, a legacy, and a life more honest and more lasting than anything either of them could have imagined possible on that painful, unforgettable evening when everything had finally begun to change. Grace Ellery visited the estate that same evening, arriving with news of a new family of children recently brought into her care. 3 siblings left without parents after a difficult winter much like the one that had once brought Theo into her keeping. Camilla rose immediately upon hearing the news, already planning the practical arrangements that would need to be made, and Theo looked up from his studies with the same quiet interest he always showed whenever new children needed help finding their footing in an uncertain world. "May I visit them this week?" he asked. "I remember what it was like before Papa found me. I would like them to know someone who understands." "Of course," Alastair said, warmth filling his chest at the easy generosity his son had grown into. The same generosity Alastair himself had quietly practiced for years before the world ever knew of it, now passed forward into a new generation with even greater openness than before. Julian set down his book and looked across the room at the family gathered there, at Camilla already discussing practical details with Grace, at Theo eager to offer comfort to children who reminded him of his own difficult beginning, at Alastair watching them all with quiet, unguarded pride. "We built something good here," he said softly, meant only for Alastair to hear. "We did," Alastair agreed, reaching for his hand in the firelight, no longer needing to check first whether anyone might be watching. "Something good and something lasting, built from the very cruelty that once nearly broke us." Outside, the autumn evening deepened into night, stars gathering slowly over the gardens where a lonely, hidden boy had once wept behind drawing-room curtains, where a grieving girl had once learned to mistake bitterness for strength, where two frightened young men had once loved each other only in careful, guarded silence. All of that old pain remained part of their history, woven permanently into the story of how they had come to this quiet, contented evening. But it no longer defined them, no longer held power over the family they had chosen, deliberately and completely, to build together. The Duke who was once mocked for everything he could not be had become, in the end, exactly the man his family needed him to become, not despite his truth, but entirely because of the courage it finally gave him to live it openly. And in the warm, firelit drawing room that evening, surrounded by the family he had built through honesty rather than obligation, Alistair Vane wanted for nothing more than exactly the life spread out before him, hard-won, imperfect, and entirely, finally his own.